This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Kipp Efinger is an independent consultant. Before going solo, Kipp served as Pact's country director in Thailand, overseeing environmental governance and health projects funded by USAID, the Department of State, Chevron, and the Global Fund. Before moving to Thailand in 2013, he was based in Pact's Washington, D.C. office, where he managed support for a diverse portfolio in the Asia and Eurasia region, including multi-million-dollar startup operations for USAID projects in Nepal and Ukraine. Kipp was also a member of Pact's Democracy and Governance Technical Team from 2008 into 2010. Before Pact, Kipp served as a program officer at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, managing economic reform programs and advocacy grants with business associations in Asia and Eurasia. Kipp has also worked for Mercy Corps in Azerbaijan and IREX in Washington, D.C. I spoke with Kipp in Bangkok. Hello, Kipp. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. It's good to be here.
And where do I find you sitting today?
I am in Bangkok, Thailand.
And as we were talking about before we recorded this show, I think it's completely fantastic that I am starting my day right now here on the other side of the planet and you are ending your day. You have spent the last several years working for Pact in Thailand. So I believe you're still with Pact in sort of a 50% mode, but what is it that you've been doing for Pact for the past couple of years there?
Yeah, I've been with Pact now for almost 8 years, and for the past 2.5 years, I've been the country director in Thailand for an office that runs a number of different programs at any given time. And when I joined Pact Thailand, we were mostly running health programs, and it's transitioned a bit into environmental governance, which is a little bit more along the lines of my experience. So it was kind of nice to see that transition happen over the time that I've been there. But I recently gave up my position as country director to become a freelance consultant. So I'm just starting that out right now. Although Pact has already offered to keep me on at least part-time as a project director for a program in which we're training government officials from around the Mekong region on environmental issues.
So you start us in a fantastic place, one I love to talk about, which is making the leap to, sort of leaving the institution and going independent. Tell us about why you made that decision.
Well, there were a number of reasons. I mean, I love Pact. It's a great organization. I've been there a long time and know a lot of people. But unfortunately, the way that project cycles work, you're kind of always in a situation where you are looking for new funding to keep yourself employed, basically. And we kind of came to a point where we had hired a number of people to run projects, and it was becoming difficult to keep a country director on full time that isn't necessarily the head of a project, or a major project. So we have a pretty big USAID project called the Mekong Partnership for the Environment. Basically, we have a chief of party who's a pretty high-level person working on that project, and I handed over the country director position. But then there's still this other project that I mentioned, which I'm going to stay on at least half time to work on.
You almost make it sound like this was something that just sort of happens regularly, and you kind of got caught in a cycle. Was there any more conscious activity around that? Like, have you gotten to a point in your career where you're like, hey, I'm ready to do this, or was it just more like, I'm kind of comfortable that this is happening now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am at a point in my career where it feels pretty comfortable to work freelance. It's a nice option to have. I mean, I've been in Bangkok now for over 2 years, really like it. My wife and I are both quite happy here. So, the other option was to move back to Washington, D.C. or try and find a job in another country. And we decided that the best option for us is to stay in Thailand. And fortunately, I have quite a bit of work in the region to keep us here for now.
Is there any other projects that you're looking at right now? Or just so, as somebody who's newly minted, jumping into a solo career, I'm sure you're going to pick up a ton of work from Pact. Is there anything that you're doing now to set up sort of, business development or getting out there and sort of, passing out your independent consultant card to say, hey, I'm available?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about for months now, because I keep thinking, it's time to start marketing myself and getting out and having meetings with people outside the organization. But it's interesting how, at least for me, it's happening pretty organically. I haven't had to go out and make some big push and send out a bunch of emails saying that I'm independent. I'll be pretty busy through the end of the year, so I haven't done that because I don't want to, I don't want to tell people I'm available and then say, okay, just kidding, I'm not available. since, I already have a bunch of work up until then. So, I mean, just, last month I was out in Nepal for a month, helping Pact's Nepal office, where we have just started doing a lot of work around earthquake relief. It's actually a governance project, but, focused on infrastructure, local infrastructure. So I've been working on that, helping them do some of their reporting, and came back to Thailand. And, now I need to organize a workshop that's happening in Hanoi in the middle of December. I have quite a bit keeping me busy. And then I guess at some point I'll probably reach a point in which, I have a lull in my calendar and I'll need to go out and start talking to other people. But, just in the course of doing regular work, you end up meeting other organizations, and then, they find out that you're independent, and then, they ask if you're available to do something or to write a proposal or whatever it is. So a little bit of that's happening, but I haven't taken up any opportunities with any other organizations yet.
The way that you describe it, I love it. You just, you've got this really calm attitude towards it. You've reached what many would consider the holy grail in our profession, of someone you have a solid resume, tons of experience, and now you're finding yourself going independent. And as you describe it, you're like, hey, it just sort of comes in. How do you think that that's been made possible? Because many people who are independent consultants, they fight on a regular basis, proposing or pitching or whatever you want to call it to get work. And you're finding it happening organically. Is there anything that you've done along your career that you think has cultivated that or fertilized the ground, where people are like, hey, yeah, Kipp, he's a guy that we can go to?
Definitely. There are some things that you can do to put yourself in a situation where you're going to find a lot of work, I think. And the best thing to do, really, I think, is to identify some skill areas in which you're going to feel confident about the services that you can give to an organization or a project. And for me, that originally started out in a technical area, which was around civil society and advocacy. But over the course of the past 5 years, I started really working a lot more on management of projects. And I got to the point where, I had somebody in the organization in Pact that was working as my supervisor at some point, and then not as my supervisor, but really mentoring me through some career choices, and made the suggestion that in order to get out to the field, I needed to build up my management skills. So I took it upon myself to look for any opportunity to start up new USAID or any projects from any donors, and ended up starting up a number of projects, including a $25 million project in Nepal and opening a Nepal office, and also starting up a similar sized project in Ukraine, and then closing down a number of projects, and basically just looking for opportunities to fill gaps in terms of management. And startups and closeout tend to be a good time to do the projects that are either moving on to new positions or haven't been hired yet. So I built kind of a skill set around that.
You've been describing how you found sort of an internal path, I assume it's within Pact over the last 4 or 5 years here, where you had a mentor, and I'd like to explore that for just a little bit subsequently. But you're talking about project startups and project shutdowns. So it sounds to me like you've become kind of like a startup expert, or maybe a shutdown expert, in as far as development projects are concerned. Would that be a good characterization?
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the parts of my resume that I feel most confident about. I mean, if I were asked to go start up a project, I've done a number of those, and I feel pretty good about my skill set there. So, it's nice to have a few things, whether it's just in your own mind or it's actually stated on your CV, that you can say, I have some degree of expertise on that. And I think that a lot of people approach development thinking that has to be a technical area. It's great to have a technical area or two, but certainly having some solid management skills don't hurt.
What would you say is like the critical piece about a startup, a startup time in a USAID project or any development project? Like, what's that kind of skill that you bring to the table?
The main skill in terms of starting up a project is really around communication. You are usually dealing with a situation in which you have a headquarters office that can't afford to send all their people out there, but you have a number of people that are, really concerned about starting up well, starting up quickly. Meanwhile, you have to get new team members on board in the country that you're in. In some cases, you might actually be coming to a brand new country where you don't even have an office. So that adds a whole other layer of having to find a place to work. having to navigate local laws, trying to develop policies and things. So communicating to people across many time zones, communicating with new people who are brand new to the organization, communicating to a vice president level or a regional director level person about what's happening, and making sure that all these different people know what's going on and that their efforts are being coordinated is really the main challenge in a startup situation. And, startup situations happen at all different levels. Sometimes a startup situation might just be starting up a new activity, or maybe you've been running a program for a number of years and you've just been asked to start doing something completely new. In the case of a Nepal startup that I was just working on over the summer, we got some extra money to start doing some work around the earthquake, specifically on governance around earthquake recovery. So, that was a kind of small scale startup. Yeah, I'd say, it's communication that's important, and management skills, being able to juggle multiple things at the same time.
What's your favorite startup story so far? You were talking about this piece in Nepal, or maybe something in Thailand that you've done where, has there been something where, everything seemed to go pear-shaped and you had to, sort of pull something out of your hat, or, maybe a story about everything just really ran smoothly?
That's a good question.
The reason why I ask is one of the things that I've experienced over the last 12 or 13 years is there's a lot of the word urgent and, immediate and, oh my gosh, this has to happen, today tends to happen a lot in our business. And I'm just wondering how much you've experienced that in these startup situations, or even just, throughout your career, and how often or not you find that urgency is real or imagined or, artificially manufactured.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And it's a funny thing because when you're working with certain donors, most donors from Western countries, they want to see development make a change in a country in the course of 3 to 5 years. And I wonder if there are cultures that think of things in terms of, a 100-year time frame instead, because it's really pretty ridiculous to think that you're going to make a significant change that's going to change the way a country is run over the long term in such a short time frame. So startups are the perfect example of that. When you have a large project that's being started up, everybody wants the head of the project to have been hired before the project started, and for that person to wait around for 6 months for the project to start. And then as soon as it starts, they're supposed to drop whatever they're doing and be in country within 2 weeks. And that almost never happens. I mean, if it happened, it would kind of be a stroke of luck. But, you're often in those types of situations. And then you come across all kinds of bureaucratic hurdles to actually get you there, to be able to get those people on board, and not just people, but other organizations, and getting an office in place. And some donors are more difficult than others. I can think of one example in which we had written a proposal, had gone out to start up a project, and we had a number of partners that were supposed to work with us on this project. And as we were getting ready to put together our agreements with those partners, we found out that we weren't allowed to give, or not that we weren't allowed to, but that it was very complicated for us to give a grant to a British organization. So it was an American donor, and there were some complexities around giving a grant to a British organization. So we ended up having to jump through all kinds of hoops to make that work. In the end, it did work out, but it required, people at a pretty high level at our headquarters, and it involved some serious expertise around grants and contracts. And so that's an example of the type of communication that can become really challenging and involves coordination of people across time zones and at different levels of the organization.
Contrast for me, shutting down an office. You said you've had some experience doing that, and that's also, there's some pretty savvy management skills, I would think, involved in shutting down an office, especially a long-term program. What are some of the things that you've experienced shutting down a program or an office, and maybe some thoughts around how you can make that work to your advantage?
A project startup is a pretty stark contrast to a project shutdown. And I guess the way I would explain that is that a project startup is kind of like a rising sun situation in which you have a lot of optimism for what's possible. You have a lot of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed people joining a new organization or joining a new project, wanting to start up a new job and looking forward to the next several years. And then you have more of a setting sun type situation with project shutdown, which can actually be kind of a sad situation because oftentimes people are being laid off. In some cases, you have staff who maybe they're not being laid off, maybe they're leaving on their own and finding new projects or new organizations to work with. In many cases, I would prefer, I guess, to start up a project rather than shut down a project. But, project shutdown is part of the project cycle. And hopefully, if you're working with an organization that really believes in being in country long term and making a positive change, then you can keep a lot of staff and you build off of the expertise that you've developed through your previous project. So, in some cases, a project shutdown just means that you've gotten to the end of one chapter in that organization's experience in country, but you are hopefully picking up on a new chapter and using that experience to do more good.
I think that's a great way you've really encapsulated it in a nice way there. One of the things I often talk about is, sort of working yourself out of a job. Would you agree with that? That, some of these projects they're meant to have a sunset period because ultimately you're supposed to achieve something, or you're supposed to get to a point where you're like, we either need to hand this over or it's time for somebody else to take a shot at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that generally our expectations in development are on too short of a time frame. I think it's good for an organization to be in a country for a number of years longer than what your typical project cycle looks like. So if an organization can, be around for 10 years, oftentimes that's a good thing. And I've seen many situations in which an organization may come to a country working on, let's say, a big USAID project, and then maybe that USAID project ends, but along the way they've picked up a few other projects, and then maybe the expatriate country director hands over to a local staff person to be the next country director on a number of smaller projects, and then maybe they pick up another big project along the way, and then the office grows. So there's always kind of an ebb and flow, and I've seen that happen in different organizations. So just because a project ending doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, and in many cases it can mean a lot of opportunities for younger staff or for local staff. And hopefully what you have is a situation in which the organization has learned quite a lot from a previous project, and they're able to use that knowledge to develop something even stronger and even better and more deeply networked than what they were doing in the beginning.
You had talked earlier about a colleague that you had, he's used to be your boss, and then you used the word mentor. I'm interested in exploring that for a few minutes. This person, you said helped you sort of move down this management path. Was it a conscious decision by you to say, hey, I like where this person's going and I think that they can really help me? Or was that also sort of an organic relationship that developed over time and you just felt like they were a champion for you? Or how'd that work out?
That's an interesting thing to explore, I think, because I don't know that everybody has the good luck to find a mentor, especially within their organization. And I think that, as I go through my career, it's something that I definitely think about, that, I'd like to be able to help people who are just figuring out their career path as well, because I was lucky enough to find somebody who was a champion for me. And the way that happened was that at some point I was working in a technical role on a democracy and governance team. And the organization went through a restructuring period in which there wasn't a position for me anymore on that technical team. So there were a number of us who were working on different technical teams, on the health teams, on livelihoods teams, and on democracy and governance teams. The transition was such that we were going to be more regionally focused. So I ended up focusing on Asia and Eurasia, which was kind of a natural fit because I speak Russian and I've worked a lot on Asia. And so, I was lucky enough to end up working on a team where the head of the Asia-Eurasia team really was looking at me and my career path as something that he could help develop. And, it could be a situation in which, if he helped me with my career path, then, that certainly serves his interest. It serves my interest. Everybody's growing in some way. So basically he asked me what it was that I wanted to be doing within 5 years. And my answer was that I wanted to be working in a field office and managing a project or working on a decent sized project out in the field. And the response that I got was, okay, well, let's take a look at your skill set. And, it seems like you're pretty solid in a technical area, but what you don't have is the management experience. So what I would advise you to do is to find opportunities to get out there and manage projects. And those opportunities are probably going to come along most easily in terms of project startups and project closeouts. So we fortunately, over the next few years, won a number of new projects, and I took every opportunity I could get to volunteer to go out and start up the projects. And the way our team was set up, that actually worked out pretty well, and I ended up managing pretty much every single startup over the course of 2 or 3 years. So I think that really built up not just my resume, but it built up my confidence and my skills around management. I ended up, managing a lot of short-term consultants. In some cases, I was managing staff for short periods of time, and really figured out ways and developed some tools to communicate across the organization. I developed kind of a Gantt chart system of tracking all the deliverables in a project, as well as all of the things in a project cycle that you need to take care of. And since then, a lot of those tools have been used by other people within the organizations and other regions. And, I've since handed it over to other people who are learning how to do startups. So I was pretty lucky to have that opportunity just pointed out to me, because it was a real niche that the organization needed to fill.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just one of those serendipitous moments where you were at the right place at the right time, but somebody also said, look, there's an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that advice would apply just about to anybody who feels like they've done enough technically, or maybe they're not even interested in working on technical issues, but they're just looking for opportunities to get out to the field or to manage things. I think in many cases, you have to have some kind of relationship with the donor, or a donor needs to know who you are for them to accept you coming out to the field and managing a project or managing an office. And if you work on startups with that donor, you'll be out in the field for, between 1 month to 6 months working on that startup. And so you'll develop trust with that donor, and that just gives you all the more opportunity to take an opportunity when it comes up later.
We're really good about talking about how we've been successful in our careers. I always like to ask everyone on the show about a time that, you failed. You fell on your face, or, just things just didn't work out and you had to recover, or you just had to sort of pick yourself up and dust yourself off. And this could be on the project level or program level, or, any time in your career. Is there a time that sticks out for you when, it just didn't seem like anything went right and you just sort of had to figure out how to keep going?
I guess one thing kind of comes to mind, which is back several years ago when I was running a grants program in Central Asia. I had made my first trip out to Tajikistan, which is a pretty remote place. There aren't that many operating out there. There are a number of NGOs working, but it's a pretty desolate landscape in terms of development work. It doesn't get that much attention, really. And because of that, I was kind of going out to that country without really knowing a lot of players or really having much guidance from other people about who I should be talking to in terms of delivering a subgrant to an organization and trying to develop a project. So basically the situation was that I was managing a grants portfolio for Central Asia from a Washington, D.C. office. And I went out and met with a whole bunch of different organizations, and I got out to a few different cities in the country. And I met with an organization that I thought seemed like they were doing some interesting work, but it was a bit outside the realm of what our donor was used to. And I don't remember exactly what the project was for, but it most likely had something to do with, advocacy around business organizations and trying to develop the more entrepreneurial class of citizens in that particular region of Tajikistan. So I ended up writing this proposal that I thought was really excellent and cutting edge, and it was different than what we were used to, and it was innovative. And then I had to get up and give this presentation in front of our board members, and then I had to give a presentation in front of our donors board. And I ended up just getting all these questions about why this project was necessary and what it was doing. And I thought I had all this stuff figured out, but it turns out that people just had way too many questions for it to seem like, a solid opportunity. So, here I am standing in front of all these really high level people just grilling me over this project. And, I ended up walking away with my tail between my legs, just kind of wondering what the hell happened there, because I thought this was something so cool that people were going to really love. And it just doesn't always work out that way. So in the end, I ended up doing a bit more research to try and salvage this project, and just realized that I wasn't going to get the support I needed to fund these guys. And then, I ended up kind of figuring something else out that we could do that was different. But yeah, it was a number of years ago, and I can't remember all the details of that project and what exactly was the problem with it. But I think it was just, it was too outside the realm of what donors were comfortable with. And sometimes that's just the way it goes. So in terms of dusting yourself off and trying to figure out how to do good in another way, I think the lesson learned for me was to really make sure that all those holes that I didn't see at the time are filled in, and make sure people have information, and make sure that you answer all the questions that could possibly come up before they come up. And so I think at that young stage in my career, I just wasn't experienced enough to see all of those questions before they happened.
Sweet. I always love those uncomfortable situations of presenting to people, and you have a fantastic idea and they tell you that it's not so fantastic. Tell us about how you got to where you are. I mean, what we often find out, you answer this question, I'm not going to prompt it. Have you always wanted to be doing exactly what you're doing, or did this career find you, or did you find it and you knew where you were going the whole time?
That's an interesting thing to contemplate, actually. I think the way it worked for me was at some point in college, I was an English major, and getting close to graduation. And, I think I had a conversation with my mom about what I was going to do. And, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a teacher. I thought maybe I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't really know how I was going to make money at that. And what I really wanted to do was get out into the world and have some interesting experiences. I wanted to travel. I wanted to spend time with like-minded people who were curious about the world. And I wanted to learn some languages and learn something about the human condition. So I realized that the best course for me was to join the Peace Corps. That's pretty much what I did. That very day, I made the decision I was going to join the Peace Corps. And I think 2 years later, or maybe a year and a half later or something, I was on a plane to Moldova. And when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Moldova, I spent 2 years in a village in a Turkic language-speaking region, and spent, a lot of time with a lot of time to think and read books. And, obviously I had a Peace Corps job, so I was teaching English, but there was a lot of downtime. And I realized after I was done with Peace Corps that, I could take the writing option, which was something that I was thinking about doing, or I could continue doing something international and consider a job in development. Also, during the time that I was in Peace Corps, I met a number of people who were working in development, who were older than me and seemed to have really interesting careers. I remember there was a guy who was working for ABA Sealy, and he was involved in helping to advise Moldova on its new constitution. And I remember I just kind of blew my mind.
You're like, wow, you're the guy who's going to be doing the constitution?
Exactly. That's a thing? Floored me. And so when I met this guy, I kind of thought that would be so cool. Maybe I should go to law school. And I started talking to him about law school. And fortunately, he explained to me that was a really terrible idea, because he went to law school and he didn't hate working on law, actually. He just got really lucky working on really cool legal reform issues in the country. But, he was telling me about friends of his or other people that he had gone to school with that didn't end up so lucky. And so nevertheless, I continued to think about the career in international development. So when I got back from Peace Corps, I spent some time, just back in California doing odd jobs here and there. And I was really looking for something full-time that was sort of like development. But I lived in San Diego at that time. And there was an IRC, International Rescue Committee, resettlement office that I was interning for a number of months. And I kept trying to get jobs there, and it just couldn't seem to land something. And plus the pay was almost nothing. So one day, I just looked in the Washington Post, and somebody had brought a Washington Post back from Washington, because it wasn't really that easy to find jobs.
I was just going to say, though, Washington Post in San Diego, and this is like, what, the early 90s or late 90s?
Yeah, like somebody physically brought a copy to San Diego. And I was like, whoa, look at all the jobs in here. This is amazing. And every single job, it seemed like, in the Washington Post just looked like a dream job. And so, I thought, this is a no-brainer. I have to move to Washington, D.C., because I'm not having any luck doing anything international in San Diego unless I joined the Border Patrol or something. So
I'm trying to imagine you. I'm trying to imagine you on the wall, man. That's fantastic.
Right, driving around in a Jeep, shooting at things. Yeah, so I decided that for me to go, and then I connected. Actually, Peace Corps is just a fantastic network, and I think it always will be. But at that time, it was quite advantageous to me because there were a few Peace Corps volunteers that had resettled themselves in Washington, D.C., and I got in touch with a few of them and told them that I was thinking about moving to D.C., and one of them said, well, yeah, by the way, there's an opening in this organization. And the organization was IREX, which used to work a lot with countries in the former Soviet Union. It just so happened that I spoke pretty decent Russian. And so I ended up getting a phone interview with them for this position and landing the position over the phone and then moving out to DC a few weeks later. And so that's kind of how it all started. It wasn't like, I'm sure when I was 10 years old, I didn't even know what international development was. I'm pretty sure at that point I still wanted to be Indiana Jones or James Bond. But a few years later, this kind of idea of working in development eventually evolved, I guess. And I think most people, when they're younger and they think they want to do something international, they probably just really have no idea what that means. And so for me, I guess I was just lucky to have discovered that while I was in the Peace Corps.
Now, you've been am I characterizing it right, or do I have the time frame right? You've been an expat basically for 2 years. Has the rest of your time been in DC, sort of doing short-term consultancies?
Well, aside from Peace Corps, I did about a 6-month stint in Azerbaijan school. So let's see, I was in the Peace Corps, and then I moved eventually to DC after the Peace Corps, spent a few years, I think about 3 years in DC. And then I was in graduate school, and I won a fellowship through the the National Security Education Program, which is it's a fellowship basically to get people to develop expertise in some of the world, like West Africa or Central Asia. And I had a few friends who were working at the time for IREX. I spoke a little Turkish because I had studied some Turkish, and I spoke Russian. And so I applied for this fellowship and had an opportunity to go out to Azerbaijan. And I did some research on internally displaced people and livelihoods development. And I also interned for Mercy Corps while I was out there. And so that was another really cool career forming experience. And, I got to learn a lot of things about what it was like to be out in the field and to work on relief. And actually at that point in my life, I really wanted to work in relief. But, I realized that it's really difficult to work in relief or disaster recovery and have a family and have some kind of a normal social life. So I know that most of the people who do that have to really balance a lot, and often they end up not having families, or they end up leaving the relief world in order to have families. So I guess, from that inspiration, from wanting to work in relief and then realizing, there were other opportunities, I got really excited about activism and civil society and just kind of followed that path for a number of years before I got more involved in just kind of project management.
We know how you got started. What do you think the next 5 years looks like? What are you most excited about in development, either for yourself or just in general? Where money is going, or where new projects are going, or where you see the future over the next 5 years?
I think, if we look at things on a global scale, I think the world is really different than when I started out in development. When you started out, people were physically bringing you Washington Posts. Exactly. Yeah. Now you can actually use this thing called the interwebs, I think it's called, and you can find jobs on there, and it actually gives you jobs. But no, what I think is really, there are a number of things that are really interesting that are happening in the world right now. And one of those things is that the United States is no longer the only big power in the world. Now we've got China starting the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. So, that's competing now with the World Bank and the ADB. We also have more and more private sector groups coming in and saying that they want to do something to give back to the community through kind of shared value partnerships, as opposed to just what used to be called corporate social responsibility, where, companies would just give money to a project. So there's a lot of thinking right now around the private sector and how the private sector can contribute to development in a project kind of way. But in terms of really doing their business but do it in a way that benefits society. So I think there's there's a quote that says, what's good for society is good for business, and vice versa. And that's really the idea around shared value. So that's an interesting development. I think also the fact that the United States is not the only big country involved in development now is an interesting change, because you have some of the countries that used to be considered really developing countries have come a long way. And you've got Brazil, which is doing really well. You have India, which is doing a lot better than it used to be doing. And you also have Russia, which in some ways, I guess, is doing worse than it was before, but it's getting more and more engaged in global politics. And so the world's changing really fast. And I think that we will probably see happening in the former Soviet Union that we thought would be resolved by now. So I think that we'll be development work, but there will definitely be some challenges for people thinking about development in the former Soviet countries for the long term. I think, Russia is not really moving in a positive direction. And I think that something either really bad or something really earth-shaking could happen that will change that region. So I think there'll be a lot of attention there. And I also just think that, businesses, we're going to see a lot more business. We're going to see businesses attending to these issues around development, and hopefully we'll see business thinking about how they can contribute to the world in a way that isn't going to destroy our planet. So, how that's going to take shape, I don't know exactly, but it seems to be percolating.
Do you think that it almost sounds like you're sort of painting a picture that's a full cycle, going back to sort of the banana republics of the days of yore, where the company ran the country kind of thing? I know you're not talking to that kind of extreme, but do you see that where larger corporations are going into places and saying, hey, look, in order for us to move our service or our product, or, we need to work this area out and we need to figure these problems out. Is that what you're referring to, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, being in Asia is enlightening because Asia is economically booming. I mean, here, I'm looking outside my window and there are cranes all over the place and there are fancy new buildings being built all over the city. And Bangkok is developing quickly, and it's not just Bangkok, it's the whole Mekong region. One place in Southeast Asia like Bangkok to a place like Laos, which isn't developing nearly as quickly, you can kind of see a picture of what will happen over time, because eventually Laos will develop, or if it's not Laos, it's going to be, Myanmar that's developing very quickly. It's going to be Cambodia that will be developing. And you can see that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the past in terms of how to develop in a smart way and develop infrastructure and develop energy policies that can help power these new cities that are, filled with air-conditioned malls and office buildings. And people are thinking more and more about how to do that in a smart way that's not just going to, destroy the rivers and destroy the air quality. For example, in Indonesia, you also have tons of companies that are working with palm oil and exploiting the land, but in some cases not really thinking about how to do that in a way that doesn't negatively affect the farmers and the people living in cities who have to breathe all the burning, peat fires and things. So you see companies really just being, if not companies directly saying that they want to be players in how to develop these regions better, you have governments who are asking for it, or you have NGOs that are pushing for it. And I think that there's a really interesting dialogue right now happening about the way that society works, the way that capitalism works, and the way that it can either be really destructive or the way that it can work hand in hand with governments and citizens and NGOs to do something that's mutually beneficial. People, in some cases, are really questioning whether capitalism is the right way to live, but you also have people questioning whether there are ways that we can adjust capitalism to create a sustainable environment and planet for people. And I don't have any idea how that's going to play out. I doubt that we'll go back to a multipolar or a bipolar world in which we're thinking it's either capitalism or communism. But I don't think that the way that the status quo in most countries works right now in terms of our capitalist model is really the model that we're going to have in 50 years, because it's just not sustainable. We're just destroying the planet at a rate that's unprecedented, frankly.
Hopefully not too much of a non sequitur, but earlier you mentioned that you made some conscious choices about not following a aid path, not following a relief path or disaster response path, and one of those reasons was specifically because because of a relationship, because of, you want to be able to have a family and children, those kinds of things. You're now living in Bangkok, your wife's with you. How have you guys sort of navigated your travels, or navigated, the travel that you do, or her travel? Is it just an ongoing conversation? Is it something that, she's bought into and excited? Is she a development person as well? Or what's that look like?
I mean, that's always going to be a challenge for anybody that's working not just in development, but doing things that are international. Even if you're working at the State Department or working for a corporation that requires you to move around, there is always going to be some difficulty there. The best case scenario for some couples is that both of them work in development, and one person's able to take full-time jobs while the other person consults. And that's been something that we've been doing a little bit of, but there's also the challenge of ending up in a place that you really like, and then trying to figure out how to either stay there or find another place that you really like. So yeah, I think, like you said, it's a conversation that's just ongoing, and I think every few years, you might be on a project and then the project ends, or you lose your 100% billable time. And then you need to figure out whether you're going to stick around and consult, or stick around and maybe take a break and look for the next opportunity, or move to another country, or move back to Washington, D.C. or wherever. And it's never going to be an easy situation. I think anybody who's getting into development needs to be pretty realistic about that. That for some people it just doesn't work, and after a few years in the international development community, they just decide that they want to be settled in some place, and then they end up moving back to wherever they're from, or they move to Washington, D.C. and take a permanent desk job in one location. So yeah, just to make a short answer out of that, it's never going to be easy. I think it's always going to be a challenge, and you have to be up for some adventure.
So there's always, you gotta be able to navigate ambiguity, basically.
Yeah, and you just have to not stress out so much about the future, because if you have a solid resume and you're smart enough, and most people are plenty smart to be doing the work that they're doing, then and you develop your career in a smart way, and you don't burn any bridges, then there's really not that much to worry about, I don't think, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done all over the world to make it a safer, happier, more equitable place to live. So there's tons of work to be done. And a lot of people are out there just figuring it out on their own, whether it's starting up their own organizations or starting up social enterprises. There are many different paths that you can take to work in international development.
Two more questions. One, what is your go-to story for your people back in San Diego, or for the person that you're thinking of mentoring, or somebody somebody who's just coming out of graduate studies or whatever, that they want to ask you questions? What's your go-to story about that time in the Peace Corps, or that time when you were in Azerbaijan or whatever, about when everything just went wrong, or some super crazy cultural thing happened that you didn't expect, that you like to tell people, that kind of describes what you do as a development professional?
A go-to, I don't know if I have a go-to story. I guess one of the craziest, most formative experiences I had as a development professional came at a time when I was living in Azerbaijan for this fellowship that I was doing over there during graduate school. And a friend of mine was working for the State Department and asked if I wanted to be an election observer in Azerbaijan. There were municipal elections, so it wasn't a presidential election or anything, but it was still a national election, and NDI and IRI and the OSCE and the State Department and lots of different people were looking for observers. So I volunteered to go observe in a southern town called Masallı in Azerbaijan. And this was, sometime like in December, so it was pretty cold. And my job was really just to stand in this election spot. Actually, I think it was a school with no heat, and just stand there for about 12 hours watching people fill out ballots and put them in boxes. And within a few hours of being in this school, watching people come in, I started to notice a couple of irregularities. I think I saw people kind of come in with ballots already filled out. I saw people, like multiple people, try and go into the same booth to fill out the ballots, or to go and drop off the ballots. And in one case, I think I looked in the ballot box and saw that there were like a bunch of ballots that were clearly stacked on top of each other. So, somebody had just like put several ballots in there. And I started making complaints or maybe not making complaints, but just pointing out to the people who were running the election, the polling station. And other people kind of, other Azerbaijanis got kind of offended by this. And I remember this guy, this old timer who had, probably lived through World War II and everything in the Soviet Union. He started yelling at me and telling me that, the Soviet Union had democracy, decades before the United States ever had democracy. And they knew how to run an election, and I should just mind my own business and go back to my own country. And this kind of thing happened several times throughout the day. And at some point, this one person who was really vocal said that, if I didn't go back to America, that he was going to kill me or something. But it was, probably not as bombastic as that, but it kind of just came across as like, yeah, we'll kill America or something. I got a phone call from my friend who was working at State Department, she just called and said, "Hey, how's it going at your polling station?" And I just told her what this guy had just said to me, because it was kind of funny and it cracked me up. And I guess she thought it was kind of funny too. But then she told somebody else what had just happened. And next thing you know, I think maybe 30 minutes later, the head of the executive committee, who's like the big shishka in this town in southern Azerbaijan, walks in, and all these people just like freeze. They're totally freaked out because like this big honcho just walked in, and he starts asking some questions. And then it turns out that the reason he was there was to investigate this death threat that had been made on an American at the polling station. So this poor old guy who had been like, cursing me this whole time was like just shaking in his boots, because not only was this guy the head of the executive committee, but he was probably not a very nice guy in real life. I mean, he owned like half of the businesses in the town, which if you spent any time in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, you know what that means.
Sure, he's a Azeri mafia. That's awesome.
Yeah. So this guy, drives up in his black Volga and just instills terror on everybody in this polling station. And so he had been there to investigate that. And then this old guy comes up to me and he just starts apologizing and saying he's so sorry and all this stuff. And I was like, no, it's fine. Like, I don't understand. I didn't feel threatened or anything. And then, the whole situation blew over. But yeah, it was a pretty funny situation. Then that executive committee boss ended up taking me to like all these palaces that he owned around the city, and like that evening after they had finished trying to stuff the ballots, I think maybe to try and get my attention away from what was going on at the polling station. But needless to say, there were a lot of irregularities, but the highlight of it was really just like this crazy experience. And I've only told you probably about 10% of all the things that happened that day. So.
Oh man, that's amazing. That's a fantastic story. I love it. We all have those. Last question for you. You have built a career that is formidable, and as you said, you've built a lot of bridges, and now you're, starting to navigate your way into this independent career. For someone who's either transitioning into development from another sector, or for somebody who's coming out of a graduate degree right now, or maybe even a bachelor's degree, what are your one or two pieces of critical advice about how to become you, how to create this sustainable career?
Well, I'd say it's really important to be easy to work with. There are a lot of people that come out there and just think they're the cat's pajamas, even if they have, a degree from an Ivy League school or they have the greatest ideas in the world. Nobody's going to want to work with you if you're difficult to work with. So I think, whether you've been in the Peace Corps or you've spent time abroad, usually you figure out that things don't always work the way you want them to work, and sometimes things don't work at all. And so I think you've got to develop a bit of a laid back attitude to work in development, but you can't be so laid back that you don't get things done. So, the first thing is that you want to be able to roll with the flow and be easy to work with, but at the same time, you need to be able to get things done. And I think the big challenge for a new person working in development is how to marry those two things. So, finding that happy medium, being able to be effective at your job and get things done however you need to get them done, but not being prima donna or really difficult to work with in those situations will take you a pretty long way. And then if you just add to that, some basic skills, whether your skill is writing well or managing things well or coordinating proposals or whatever it is, I think that is generally what you need in the door in an organization. And then from there, you find your technical niche, you find people that will work with you, and you find a team, and you just take it from there.
Kipp, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.